Welcome back to another episode of the Different Topic Same Host podcast. This is your host, Jana Muhammad. Today's topic is about one of the greatest composers of all time, Tchaikovsky. He excelled in genres from the symphonic and opera to chamber music and ballet. He might not be very famous among us, but I can assure you that many people's introduction to classical music has been through some of his works, like the Nutcracker or the Cannon Fire of the 1812 Overture. First thing I'm going to talk about in today's episode is his start, and it was a little bit difficult for him, as he was separated early from his mother because of her death from cholera in 1854, when he was 14, which caused an emotional trauma that lasted the rest of his life. He tried to cope with his mother's death by making his first serious attempt at composition, a waltz in her memory. At this moment, Tchaikovsky's father's role was very important, as he sent him back to school in order to occupy the boy's mind. And here is a side note for you guys, that his father had also contracted cholera, but luckily he recovered fully from it. At this point, you can say that they were cursed with this disease. Even Tchaikovsky's cause of death was reported to be cholera. But that is another story that I'm going to tell you about at the end of this episode. Back to Tchaikovsky's early days, he tried to compensate his isolation with friendships with fellow students that became lifelong. Although Tchaikovsky was interested in music and composition from a young age, a lot of people didn't see that he had the potential to be a successful composer, even his friends at school. It became even worse in 1855, when Tchaikovsky's father funded private lessons with Rudolf Gwandinger, and as any caring parent, he wanted to know if there was a career for his son. Gwandinger's response was that he was impressed by the boy's talent, no doubt, but he saw nothing to suggest a future composer or a performer. I don't need to remind you that this boy, who had nothing to suggest a future composer, is indeed Tchaikovsky, who was one of the best composers in history. At this point, you might be wondering, how did Tchaikovsky become the great composer he was? Well, first, none of these doubts and disbeliefs have changed Tchaikovsky's mind. In fact, he continued, and in 1861 he attended RMS classes in music theory taught by Nikolai Zaremba at the Mikhailovsky Palace, now known as the Russian Museum. These classes prepared him for the St. Petersburg Conservatory, which opened in 1862. And let me tell you, the conservatory was a changing point in Tchaikovsky's life. It transformed him into a musical professional, with tools to help him thrive as a composer, and in-depth exposure to European principles and musical forms gave him a sense that his art was not exclusively Russian or Western. You can basically say that he had his own mindset, and it was completely different and remarkable from the other composers at his time. He was even an inspiration and a starting point for Russian composers to build their own individual styles. Tchaikovsky had a lot of great music, and I don't think that one episode is going to be enough to mention all of his work. But in today's episode, I'm going to mention two of his work, and personally, they are my favorites. The first one is Swan Lake. Even though it is known to be one of the most famous ballets in the world, it wasn't a big hit when it premiered in 1877. Enough talking for now, and let's listen to it. The second one is The Waltz of the Flowers. It is also a ballet composed by Tchaikovsky and premiered in 1892. It is a piece of orchestral music from second act of the Nutcracker, and here is a part from it. Now it's time to talk about Tchaikovsky's death that I have mentioned earlier in the episode. The story started in the 1st of November 1893 when Tchaikovsky went to the theater to see Alexander Ostrovsky's play The Ardent Heart. Afterwards, he spent the evening in a restaurant called Liners with some of his friends, his nephew, and his brother, Modest. During the meal, like any other person, Tchaikovsky ordered a glass of water. But the waiter at that time told him that they didn't have any boiled water. But Tchaikovsky didn't care about that and accepted to drink the unboiled water, even though he was warned by others in his party to not drink that water. But what's wrong with this water, and why does it matter if it's boiled or not? Well, during this period of time, there was an outbreak of cholera in the city, and because of that, health regulations required that water served in restaurants to be boiled before being served. The next morning, at Modest's apartment, Tchaikovsky was not in the sitting room drinking tea as usual, but in bed complaining of diarrhea and upset stomach. And I just want to ask a question. Did he really have to drink that unboiled water? I mean, being thirsty is for sure better than diarrhea and stomach ache, right? Anyways, back to the story. Tchaikovsky made things even worse when he refused to get a doctor. And again, why did he do that? It is another question that will remain unanswered. Eventually, or finally, a doctor came called Lev Bertenson. He made a diagnosis of cholera. And that is when everyone knew that this was his end. And he died at 3 a.m. on the 6th of November, 1893. You can definitely say that Tchaikovsky's life was interesting and full of obstacles, but that doesn't change the fact that he was a spectacular composer. That's it for today's episode. I hope that you have enjoyed it. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which topic should I talk about next. See you next week.